Before we start, I need you to do something for me. Whatever you're doing right now, wherever you are, just stay for a minute. Because this story, it's gonna sit with you. I'm not gonna tell you it's a love story, because that's too simple. And I'm not gonna tell you it's a story about betrayal, because that's not the whole truth either. What I'm gonna tell you is this. A man stood in a courtroom in Richmond, Virginia, looked a judge in the eye and denied his own baby, his newborn son, said the words out loud, under oath, like that child didn't exist. And then the judge opened a file. And what was inside that file didn't just prove he was lying. It cracked open a secret that his family had been burying for years. A secret about another child. A child nobody was supposed to know about. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking you know how this ends. Trust me, you don't. So get comfortable, turn the volume up, and whatever you do, don't skip ahead, because every piece of this story matters. Let's go back to the beginning. The Richmond City Family Court on East Main Street hadn't been renovated since the early 90s, and it showed. The carpet in the hallway was the color of a bruise that never healed, some industrial shade of purple-gray that probably looked bold in a catalogue, but just looked tired now. The fluorescent lights buzzed with that specific frequency that gets inside your skull if you sit there long enough. Someone had taped a handwritten sign to the water fountain. Out of order. The tape was yellowing. The sign had been there a while. Courtroom 4B smelled like old wood and the cheap lemon cleaning solution the janitors used on everything. The benches, the tables, the judge's podium. Mixed with the faint staleness of too many bodies cycling through a room that didn't get enough airflow. The ventilation system rattled every 40 seconds or so, a metallic cough that everybody in the room had stopped hearing except Kyra Stone, because Kyra Stone was hearing everything right now. Every sound was amplified, every creak of a bench, every shuffle of paper, every breath. She was sitting 3 rows back. Not because she'd chosen the seat, her legs had simply stopped cooperating somewhere between the metal detector and the courtroom door. She'd made it this far and that was it. Done. Her body had made the executive decision to sit down before she fell down, and now here she was, a worn leather folder pressed against her ribs so tight her knuckles had gone bone white 20 minutes ago. Inside that folder was everything she had. Birth certificate, medical records from VCU Medical Center, screenshots of text messages, 147 of them, printed at the FedEx on Broad Street because her printer had been broken since March, and she couldn't afford to fix it. Screenshots she'd saved on a phone she could barely keep active, paying the bill 3 days late every month because those messages were proof. Proof that the man sitting at the respondent's table had once texted her at 1:37 a.m. just to say, "I keep thinking about that thing you said about the kid with the flashlight. You're something else, you know that?" Kenyon Carter didn't look at her, not once. He sat between 2 attorneys, a man and a woman, both in charcoal suits that probably cost more than Kyra's Honda. His jaw was locked. His posture was the kind of straight that only happens when someone's been trained to sit that way since childhood. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, fingers interlaced, like this was a quarterly board meeting and not a hearing about whether his own child existed. The woman sitting behind Kenyon, his firm's junior associate, brought along to take notes nobody would ever read, kept clicking a ballpoint pen. Click, click, click. Kyra wanted to rip it out of her hand and throw it across the room. She didn't. She sat there. She held her folder. She breathed. Judge Garrison entered from the side door at exactly 10:15 a.m. She was a black woman in her early 60s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the kind of expression that said she'd seen every version of this story and hadn't been impressed by any of them. She sat down, arranged her papers, took a sip from a travel mug that had a faded NPR logo on the side, and opened the file. This court is hearing case number 24 FC0847, Stone vs. Carter. Petitioner claims paternity and seeks child support and custodial determination. She looked up. "Mr. Carter, do you acknowledge paternity of the minor child in question?" And Kenyon, the same man who had traced the freckles on Kyra's shoulders at 3 in the morning in his penthouse in the Fan District, who had laughed so hard at one of her terrible jokes that he'd knocked a glass of Merlot off the coffee table and didn't even care, who had pressed his forehead against hers in the dark and whispered, I didn't know I was missing something until you—" That man straightened his tie, cleared his throat and said, "Your Honor, I have no biological connection to this child. I've never acknowledged paternity. I respectfully request this case be dismissed." The courtroom didn't react. That was the part that would stay with Kyra for years. Not what he said, but what happened after. Nothing. No gasps, no murmurs, no objections from the gallery. Just the ventilation system rattling and the associate clicking her pen and the judge writing something down. Like what Kenyon had said was perfectly reasonable. Like Kyra was the unreasonable one for being there at all. Like a man denying his infant son was just Tuesday. Kyra's attorney, a woman named Deborah Marsh who operated out of a 2-room office on West Gray Street and charged a rate Kyra was putting on a credit card she'd maxed out twice already, reached over and squeezed Kyra's wrist under the table. A gesture that meant stay calm and I'm sorry, and we knew this might happen all at once. But Judge Garrison wasn't done. She set down her pen, removed her reading glasses, and reached for a second file, a sealed envelope with a state laboratory stamp that had been delivered to her office at 8:47 that morning by courier. Nobody in the courtroom had seen it come in. Not Kenyon's attorneys, not Deborah Marsh, not Kyra. "Before I rule on the motion to dismiss," Judge Garrison said, her voice flatter than before, "there is a matter this court needs to address." She opened the envelope, pulled out a report, read silently for approximately 30 seconds. The room was quiet. Actually quiet this time, not the polite performative quiet of before, but something thicker. Kenyon's lead attorney leaned over and whispered something. Kenyon didn't respond. Judge Garrison looked up, first at Kenyon, then at Kyra. Then back at Kenyon. "Mr. Carter," she said, "a routine child welfare background check conducted by the Virginia Department of Social Services flagged a DNA cross-reference in the state database." She paused. The clicking pen stopped. "The results confirm biological paternity between the respondent and the minor child Damian Stone. Additionally," she paused again, longer this time, "the cross-reference has identified a partial sibling match with a second child currently in foster care in Henrico County. The biological mother listed for that child is Tonya Carter." Silence. The kind that doesn't just fill a room, it empties it. Kenyon didn't move, didn't blink. His lead attorney said, "Your Honor, we request an immediate recess." But the words sounded far away, like they were coming through water, and Kenyon wasn't listening anyway. He was staring at the table in front of him, at his own folded hands, and something was happening behind his eyes that Kyra had never seen before. Not anger, not calculation, not the controlled blankness he'd perfected over 34 years of being Ken Carter's eldest son. It was collapse, quiet, internal, total. Like watching a house of cards come apart in slow motion, every piece holding still for one more second and then just giving up. Kyra sat 3 rows back with her folder and her maxed-out credit card and her baby at home with Willa, and she watched the color drain out of Kenyon Carter's face, and she felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief, not justice. Pity. An ugly, inconvenient stab of pity for the man who had just denied their son, because she understood in that moment that Kenyon hadn't just been lying to the court. He'd been obeying. The way he'd always obeyed. The way his father had taught him to obey. And the machine he'd been obeying had just broken open for everyone to see. The associate's pen was on the floor. Nobody picked it up. The ventilation system rattled. Judge Garrison closed the file. Recess granted, 15 minutes. The gavel came down. Kyra didn't move. Neither did Kenyon. The radiator in the corner hissed. Somewhere in the hallway, a phone rang, and nobody answered it. Now. "I know you have questions. How did they get here? Who is this woman? Who is this man? And why? Why would someone deny their own child in a courtroom full of strangers? To understand that, we need to go back. 11 months back. To a charity event, a borrowed dress, and the 3 months that changed everything. 11 months earlier, Kyra Stone's life fit inside a Honda Civic, with a cracked windshield and a passenger side mirror held on by duct tape she'd bought at the Dollar General on Chamberlain Avenue. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Church Hill, The side of Church Hill that hadn't been gentrified yet, the side where the corner store still had bulletproof glass and the streetlights didn't always work. Her roommate Megan had moved in with her boyfriend in Short Pump back in the spring, which meant Kyra was covering rent alone now, $150 a month, on a teacher's salary, in a city that kept building luxury condos and acting confused about why nobody could afford to live there. She taught second grade at Fairfield Elementary, our Title I school on the East End, where 60% of the kids qualified for free lunch, and the building's heating system was held together with the same kind of optimism that kept the whole school running, stubborn, underfunded, and refusing to quit. Kyra loved it, loved the kids, loved the chaos of 23 7-year-olds trying to learn fractions while someone was always crying and someone else had lost a shoe. She was good at it. The principal, Mrs. Okafor, had told her as much twice, which from Mrs. Okafor was basically a standing ovation. What Kyra was not good at was letting people see her. Not really. She had friends, work friends, happy hour friends, the kind of people you text when you need help moving a couch, but nobody who knew about Rennie. Nobody who knew about the pregnancy at 21, the positive test she'd taken in the bathroom of the diner off Route 1, where she'd been waitressing to put herself through community college. Rennie had told her he loved her on a Tuesday. She'd told him about the baby on a Thursday. By the following Wednesday, his number was disconnected. She found out later he'd moved to Virginia Beach. Didn't matter. The specifics of where someone goes don't change the fact that they went. She lost the pregnancy at 11 weeks, alone. In a bathroom at Southside Community Hospital, with fluorescent lights that hummed a half-tone off from the silence, and a nurse who was kind but busy and had 3 other patients waiting. Kyra had held onto the edge of the sink and stared at the tile floor. Beige chipped in the corner near the drain, and something inside her had closed like a fist. Tight, permanent. That was 5 years ago. 5 years of careful distance. 5 years of being friendly but not close, approachable but not available. The kind of woman who made everyone feel welcome while keeping the door to herself, locked from the inside. So when she met Kenyon Carter at the Richmond Public Schools Foundation fundraiser that October, she wasn't looking for anything. She wasn't open. She wasn't ready. She was there because her principal had asked her to speak for 3 minutes about classroom needs, and she'd said yes, before understanding what that actually meant, standing at a podium in a dress she'd found at the Goodwill on Williamsburg Road, navy blue, slightly too long, still smelling faintly of someone else's detergent, in a room full of people whose watches cost more than her car. The event was at the Valentine Museum on Clay Street. Wine, cheese plates nobody was eating, a string quartet in the corner playing something classical that Kyra couldn't name. The room was all exposed brick and soft lighting, and every person in it seemed to know exactly how to hold a wine glass without looking like they were holding a wine glass. Kyra did not know how to do that. She gave her speech, 3 minutes about a boy named Tyler who brought a flashlight to school every day because the electricity in his apartment had been cut off and he still wanted to read, and her voice shook at the beginning, but by the end, the room was quiet in a way that wasn't polite. It was real. Then she stepped off the stage and immediately looked for the exit. She found the coat check instead. And Kenyon was already there. He was tall, 6'2" maybe, with the kind of angular face that looked like it belonged in a courtroom or on a campaign poster. Pale blue eyes, a jaw that could have been carved from something expensive. But what Kyra noticed first wasn't any of that. It was his shoes. They were slightly scuffed on the left toe, a tiny imperfection on an otherwise polished surface. She didn't know why it made her trust him, but it did. "Your speech was the only honest thing that happened tonight," he said. She almost laughed. "That's a low bar." "It is." He paused. "I'm Kenyon." "Kyra." He waited, like he expected her to recognize his name. She didn't. His last name meant nothing to her. She didn't follow Richmond politics or real estate or the social pages of the Times-Dispatch. She barely followed the news. She was too busy grading papers and figuring out how to make rent. That was the thing that made him stay. She could see it. A flicker of something crossing his face, surprise maybe, or relief. Like he'd been carrying a label around his neck for 34 years, and someone had just looked at him without reading it. What followed were 3 months that existed outside the architecture of both their lives. Late drives along the river with the windows down, the radio on some classic rock station. Neither of them cared about, but neither of them changed. Takeout from the Thai place on Carey Street that always gave too much rice. Conversations that started about nothing, a bad movie, a weird thing a kid said in class, a building being torn down on Broad Street, and ended at 4 in the morning about everything. His mother, her father, the specific texture of growing up knowing you were someone's afterthought. They didn't go to restaurants, didn't post anything, didn't tell anyone. It existed in the space between his penthouse in the Fan and her apartment in Church Hill, in the 40 minutes of downtown Richmond that separated their zip codes, and it was the most real thing either of them had felt in years, maybe ever. Kyra knew it couldn't last, knew. She knew it the way you know a good song is about to end. You can feel the bridge coming, you can hear the key change, and you just want to stay in the verse a little longer. She knew Kenyon Carter was from a world that didn't include women who drove cars held together with duct tape and prayer. She knew his family would never accept her. She didn't even know his family, but she knew. And then the test came back positive. She took it in the bathroom of her apartment on a Tuesday night in January. It was cold. The space heater in the hallway was doing that thing where it made noise but didn't actually produce heat. She sat on the edge of the bathtub and looked at the 2 lines and felt something she could only describe as vertigo. Like the floor had opened up and she was falling, except she wasn't moving. She told Kenyon 3 days later in his kitchen while leftover pad thai sat on the counter getting cold. She watched him carefully. Not his mouth, his eyes. Because eyes are harder to control than words. 9 seconds. She counted later, replaying it. 9 seconds of absolute silence, and in those 9 seconds she watched something behind Kenyon's eyes go dark. Like someone had reached inside and turned off a switch. The kitchen light was buzzing. He'd mentioned weeks ago that he needed to get it replaced, and in that buzzing silence she could hear her own heartbeat and the refrigerator humming and absolutely nothing else. Kenyon. He opened his mouth, closed it. Say something. I need to. I need some time to think. She nodded. She didn't cry. She'd learned a long time ago that crying in front of people who are about to leave is like handing them permission. She drove home. The windshield crack caught the light from the street lamps on Monument Avenue, fracturing everything into pieces. 48 hours later, his number was disconnected. She tried calling from the school phone, from a payphone outside the 7-Eleven on Brooklyn Park Boulevard, an actual payphone. She didn't even know those still existed. Every number went to voicemail or a recording. She drove to his building in the Fan. The doorman, a guy named Curtis who'd always nodded at her, said Mr. Carter had left instructions that she wasn't to be allowed up. Curtis couldn't look at her when he said it. He studied the lobby floor, that polished marble like there was something fascinating in the pattern. "Okay," Kyra said. She walked back to her car, put her hands on the steering wheel, sat there for 11 minutes without starting the engine. The parking meter ticked beside her. A couple walked past holding hands, laughing about something she couldn't hear. The heater in the Honda took 4 minutes to kick in. By then her fingers were numb, so that's what happened to Kyra, a man who made her feel seen for the first time in her life, and then vanished like she'd imagined the whole thing. But here's what Kyra didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because what happened on the other side of that silence, it wasn't indifference, it was something worse. It was a son doing exactly what his father told him to do, and his father. His father had been making people disappear for a very long time. The night Kyra told him about the pregnancy, Kenyon drove straight to Henrico County. 40 minutes on I-64 West, hands locked on the steering wheel of his Audi at exactly 11 miles over the speed limit, the satellite radio playing something he wasn't hearing. He pulled into the circular driveway of his father's house, a Georgian colonial on a 5-acre lot in the River Road corridor that the Richmond magazine had featured twice, and sat in the car for 6 minutes before going inside. Ken Carter was in the study, of course he was. The study was where Ken Carter conducted all business that mattered, which was everything. Because to Ken Carter, everything was business. The room smelled like leather furniture. and the 18-year-old Glenfiddich he poured every evening at exactly 9 o'clock, not because he particularly loved Scotch, but because consistency was a form of control. And control was the only religion Ken Carter practiced. "I need to talk to you." Ken didn't look up from the legal journal he was reading, or pretending to read. "Sit down." "Dad, sit down." Kenyon sat. He was 34 years old, a named partner at a major firm, and he sat down in his father's study like he was 12 again. Called in to explain a grade that was an A- instead of an A, he told his father everything. Kyra, the 3 months, the pregnancy. He spoke quickly, like if he got it all out fast enough it wouldn't have time to become real. The study was quiet when he finished, just the mantel clock ticking and the ice settling in Ken's glass. Ken closed the journal. Set it on the arm of the chair with the spine facing out, the way he kept every book, every file, every object in this room, aligned with a precision that said more about him than any conversation ever could. He crossed one leg over the other, took his time. "What's her name?" "Kyra Stone. She's a teacher, elementary school." "Where?" "Fairfield." Ken nodded. Not the kind of nod that means understanding, the kind that means calculation. "You will end this tonight." His voice was flat, conversational almost, like he was suggesting they change restaurant reservations. "Or I will end it for you. And you won't like my version, Kenyon." "Dad, she's not—" "I didn't ask what she is. I'm telling you what she's going to become if you don't handle this. A liability, a headline, a settlement. Choose one." Kenyon opened his mouth. Something rose in his throat. A sentence, maybe. Something about Kyra not being a settlement, about the way she'd talked about that kid with the flashlight, about the way she made him feel like a human being instead of a business card. But the sentence died somewhere between his chest and his vocal cords. It just stopped. Like a car that runs out of gas on the highway, you can see where you want to go, but you're not moving. 25 years of obedience doesn't dissolve in one conversation, especially not when the person you're obeying built the room you're sitting in, the career you're living, the name you introduce yourself with at every event and every meeting and every morning in the mirror. Within a week, Ken had a file. Private investigator, a guy he'd used before for sensitive client matters. 6 pages on Kyra Stone. Income, $42, $300 before taxes. Mother, Willa Stone, retired textile worker, Petersburg, receiving disability for early onset arthritis. Address, 2847 Q Street, Church Hill, Unit B. Credit score, 614. Student loans, $23,000 outstanding. Vehicle, 2011. Honda Civic, 178. 0 miles. No criminal record. No prior lawsuits. No social media presence of note. Ken presented the file to Kenyon the way he presented everything, as evidence, as proof of a conclusion he'd already reached. This is what she is. This is what women like this do. They find men like you and they make themselves necessary and then they make themselves expensive. Kenyon knew it wasn't true. He knew it the way you know the sun is up when you're in a windowless room. You know it, but you can't feel it. And after a while the knowing stops being enough, because there's nobody in the room confirming it, and the walls are closing in. And the man you've been deferring to for your entire life is telling you the room is dark, and you should be grateful for the shelter. So Kenyon disappeared. Changed his personal number, had his assistant, a woman named Priya who'd worked for the firm for 8 years and had never once asked a question she didn't need to ask, screen all calls, block all emails, return all certified letters. When Kyra's name appeared on anything and a message, a filing, a desperate handwritten note she'd left with Curtis the doorman, Priya made it vanish, efficiently, quietly, the way things vanished in the Carter family. Kyra found out she was truly alone on a Wednesday in February. She'd driven to the fan district one more time, parked outside Kenyon's building on Stewart Avenue. The windows of his penthouse were dark. Curtis was at the desk. He saw her through the glass doors and looked away. She sat in the car with the engine running. The heat was barely working. The Honda ran hot or cold, and today it was choosing cold. Her phone sat face up on the passenger seat. No missed calls, no texts. The last message from Kenyon was 6 weeks old. Leaving the office now. "You want me to grab food?" She read it 3 times. Then she drove home. The months that followed had a rhythm that Kyra would later describe, to no one, as surviving in slow motion. She taught until her 8th month, wore loose sweaters, smiled at co-workers, answered, "I'm great, just tired," to every question that got close to the truth. At night she lay in bed and stared at the ceiling crack that ran from the light fixture to the corner of the room like a river on a map, and she thought about Rennie, about her father, about the specific kind of cruelty that men practice not with violence but with absence, the simple act of not being there, of not answering, of not existing in a space they'd promised to fill. She moved back to Petersburg in her 7th month, Willa's house, the same 2-bedroom she'd grown up in, with the lavender paint in the bedroom she'd done herself at 14 and the kitchen faucet that dripped every 8 seconds. She'd counted, as a kid, to fall asleep. The dripping was louder now, or maybe she was just listening harder. Willa didn't ask many questions, not at first. She looked at Kyra's belly and then at Kyra's face and whatever she saw there, the exhaustion, the thinness around the eyes, the way her daughter flinched every time a phone rang, told her everything the words couldn't. "You're staying," Willa said, not a question. "Yeah." Kyra set her bag on the bed. The mattress springs groaned. "I'm staying." Willa made chicken soup that night. Not the good kind, the kind from a can, Campbell's, because the arthritis had gotten bad enough that chopping onions was a 20-minute ordeal now. They ate in the kitchen with the TV on in the other room, some game show Willa watched every night at 7. Neither of them talked. The soup was too salty. Kyra ate 2 bowls anyway. Damien was born on a Tuesday in October at Southside Regional Medical Center. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Dark hair, eyes that hadn't decided what color they were going to be yet. The delivery room smelled like antiseptic and sweat, and the fluorescent light above the bed had a faint flicker that nobody else seemed to notice. When the nurse placed him on Kyra's chest, she made a sound that came from somewhere she'd bricked over years ago. Raw, cracked, not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. "Hey," she whispered. Her voice was wrecked. "I'm right here, you hear me? I'm not going anywhere." Willa was in the corner of the room, sitting in a plastic chair, crying quietly into a paper towel. Not sad crying. Something else. That night, after the hospital had gone quiet and Damien was asleep in the bassinet beside the bed, Kyra lay awake and stared at the acoustic tiles in the ceiling and tried to do the math on her life. Teacher's salary minus rent, minus student loans, minus formula, minus diapers, minus the medical bills that were about to arrive. The numbers didn't work. They hadn't worked in months. She was going to have to file for assistance. She was going to have to call the legal aid office on Monday. She was going to have to take Kenyon Carter to court. Her phone sat on the bedside table. She picked it up, opened the old text thread. "Leaving the office now. You want me to grab food?" 9 months old now, that message. She stared at it like it might rearrange itself into something different. It didn't. She put the phone face down and closed her eyes. The bassinet creaked when Damien shifted. The hallway outside was empty, except for the distant squeak of a nurse's shoes on linoleum. And that's where we circle back to the courtroom. Kyra filed the case. Kenyon hired lawyers to fight it. And for a few months, it looked like the Carter machine was going to win, the way it always did. Motion to dismiss, no evidence, case closed. That was the plan. But the thing about plans built on lies, they only work as long as the lies stay buried. And this one had been buried in a state database waiting, and a judge named Garrison was about to dig it up. The recess lasted 15 minutes, felt like 3 hours. Kyra didn't leave the courtroom. She stayed where she was, hands in her lap, folder on the bench beside her. Deborah Marsh was talking in a low voice about procedure and next steps and what the DNA report meant legally. But Kyra wasn't processing any of it. She was thinking about the look on Kenyon's face when Judge Garrison had said his mother's name. Tonya Carter. Kyra had heard that name exactly once, on a night in November in Kenyon's kitchen, when he'd had 2 glasses of wine and his guard had slipped just enough to let something real out. He'd told her about his mother. Not much. Enough. Depression. A facility outside Charlottesville. His father telling him not to visit. He'd said it with his back to her, pretending to wash a dish that was already clean. And his voice had gone flat in a way that told Kyra everything his words weren't saying. She hadn't pushed. She'd just stood behind him and put her hand on his back, between his shoulder blades, and he'd stopped washing the dish and stood there with the water running, not moving for almost a full minute. Now she was sitting in this courthouse, and the sealed file had just blown a hole through everything both of them thought they knew about the Carter family. Kenyon left through the side entrance. His attorneys were behind him talking. The lead guy, Sullivan, a partner from McGuire Woods, was saying something about filing an emergency motion, about challenging the chain of custody on the forensic report, about the procedural irregularity of a state agency submitting evidence to a family court without prior notice to counsel. Legal words, strategy words, the kind of words Kenyon had built his entire career on. He wasn't listening. He got in his car and the black Audi parked in the lot on 9th Street, the one his father had suggested he buy because perception is currency, Kenyon, and nobody trusts a lawyer in a Toyota, and sat there with the engine off and the windows up. The car smelled like the leather cleaner he used every Sunday. A habit, something he did to feel in control. The bottle was still in the glove compartment, right next to the sunglasses case and the parking garage access card for the firm. He stared at the glove compartment, did not open it. Sullivan knocked on the window. Kenyon waved him off. Sullivan looked at the other attorney, Patricia, from the family law department, and they exchanged a glance that said, "This is above our pay grade," and walked back toward the courthouse. Kenyon drove to Henrico County. The house looked the same as it always did. Georgian colonial white columns, azalea bushes trimmed to mathematical precision. The American flag on the porch that Ken flew not out of patriotism, but because it signals reliability. Everything in place, everything exactly where his father had decided it should be. Kenyon walked in without knocking. First time in his life. Ken was standing at the window in the study, phone in his hand, back to the door, which meant he already knew. Someone from the courthouse, a clerk, a contact, someone in the network he'd spent 40 years building, had already called. He turned around slowly when he heard Kenyon's footsteps. His face was composed, neutral, the way it always was when the stakes were highest, because Ken Carter treated composure the way other people treated armor, and the bigger the threat, the calmer he got. "Tell me about the child." Ken slid the phone into his breast pocket, buttoned his jacket. A small, deliberate gesture, the kind of move a man makes when he wants you to know he's not rattled, even if he is. Especially if he is. Which one? 2 words, which one? And the room tilted, because that question, casual, flat, almost bored, didn't just confirm the file. It suggested scope. It meant there might be more than one erased child. It meant Kenyon's father had a system, not an exception. A method for making inconvenient people disappear from the family record, the way he made inconvenient clauses disappear from contracts. "The child in foster care," Kenyon said. His voice was even, barely. "The one whose mother is listed as Tonya Carter. My mother, your wife." Ken walked to the leather chair, sat down, crossed one leg over the other with the unhurried precision of a man who believes he controls the tempo of every conversation he's in. "Your mother was unwell. That's not... She was committed. She wasn't capable of raising a child. She wasn't capable of raising you, Kenyon, which is why I did it. The pregnancy was discovered during her care. The facility recommended termination. She refused. The child was delivered and placed with the state. I signed the paperwork." "You signed the paperwork." "I made a decision. I protected this family. I protected you. A 3-year-old is in foster care in Henrico County. A 3-year-old is being cared for, adequately, by the state. He's your son. He's a complication." Ken reached for the scotch on the side table, poured 2 fingers, didn't offer one. "Sit down. We need to discuss the paternity case and how to limit the exposure." Kenyon stood in the doorway and looked at the man who had taught him how to read a contract, how to hold a room, how to build a career, how to control a narrative. The man who had taught him that attachment was a liability, and the most dangerous thing a Carter could do was need someone who didn't serve the plan. And Kenyon thought, I did the same thing. Different courtroom, different words. But the action was identical. A child was inconvenient, so he made the child go away, denied paternity under oath, looked straight ahead, didn't flinch, same instinct, same cowardice, same blood. "I'm not sitting down," Kenyon said. He left. He drove. I-64 east, then south on 95, then back roads he didn't recognize, past gas stations and Baptist churches and tobacco fields, and houses with trucks in the yard. His phone was vibrating in the center console. Sullivan, Patricia, a number he didn't recognize, his brother Timo's name flashing 3 times. He didn't answer. The radio was off and the only sound was the tires on asphalt and his own breathing, which was too fast, which had been too fast since the judge said his mother's name. He ended up in Petersburg at 2 in the morning, parked on the street outside a house with a chain-link fence and a porch light that had a moth circling it. Willa's house. Kyra was in there. Damien was in there. His son was asleep in there, 3 months old, breathing in whatever uncomplicated way babies breathe before the world gets to them. Kenyon cut the engine. The dashboard went dark. The moth kept circling. A dog barked somewhere down the block, then gave up. The air inside the car cooled quickly. January had turned to February, had turned to the kind of Virginia winter that wasn't dramatic enough to be beautiful, just grey and persistent and cold in a way that settled into everything. He sat there for almost an hour, not thinking exactly, more like sifting through the wreckage of the day and trying to figure out which pieces were his and which were his father's, and whether it even mattered anymore because the damage was the same regardless of who built the bomb. At 2:54 a.m., the porch light turned off. Someone going to bed. The moth disappeared into the dark. Kenyon started the engine, pulled away from the curb. The tires crunched on gravel. Nobody inside the house heard him leave. "So let me ask you something. If you were Kenyon, sitting in that car at 2 in the morning, knowing what you now know about your father, knowing what you did to Kyra, knowing there's a baby inside that house who has your blood in your eyes and no idea you exist, what would you do? Would you knock? Would you drive away? Would you keep being the man your father built? Or would you tear the whole thing down and start over? Because that's exactly the choice Kenyon Carter was about to make. The next 4 weeks unfolded like a demolition. Kenyon resigned from Carter and Mercer on a Thursday morning, 9 days after the hearing. He didn't do it dramatically. No press release, no firm-wide email, no speech in the conference room. He walked into the managing partner's office at 7:45 a.m. before anyone else was on the floor, and said he was taking an indefinite leave that was actually a permanent departure. The managing partner, a man named Gerald Foley who'd been at the firm for 31 years and had survived 3 recessions, 2 divorces, and a prostate cancer scare, looked at Kenyon for a long time and said, "Your father, no." "No." Gerald nodded. Took a sip of the coffee his assistant had brought him. Black, no sugar, in the same mug he'd used since 2004. The one with the UVA Law School logo that was half rubbed off. "You want me to tell him? I want you to do whatever you want, Gerald." Kenyon packed his office in 20 minutes. There wasn't much personal. A photo of his mother from before the facility, back when she still smiled with her whole face. And a pen his law school roommate had given him as a joke that said, "World's okayest lawyer" in gold lettering. Everything else belonged to the firm. He left the framed diploma on the wall. The security guard in the lobby, a guy named Deshawn, who always had earbuds in and never said much, watched Kenyon carry a single cardboard box to the parking garage. "You leaving for real?" he asked. "Yeah. All right." Deshawn went back to his phone. That was the whole goodbye. Kenyon called Timo that afternoon. Timo Cruz wasn't actually Kenyon's brother by blood. He was Kenyon's half-brother on his mother's side, which was more complicated and more real than any corporate org chart could capture. Timo was the Carter kid Ken acknowledged least and criticized most. He'd gone to VCU instead of UVA, studied social work instead of law, worked for Henrico County's Department of Social Services instead of a firm with his family's name on the letterhead. Ken called him the soft one at dinners, which he said like a medical diagnosis. But Timo was the only person Kenyon trusted enough to call. They met at a diner on West Broad Street, the one near the Walmart, not the trendy one downtown. Formica tables, coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since the morning shift, and nobody had complained about it. A waitress named Rhonda, who called everyone Hon and refilled cups without being asked. Kenyon told him everything: the hearing, the file, the foster child. The fact that Ken had signed paperwork to surrender a baby, their mother's baby, to the state while she was institutionalized. Timo listened without interrupting. He stirred his coffee with a straw. Who stirs coffee with a straw? Timo did, always had, and when Kenyon finished he was quiet for almost a minute. "The kid's name is Marcus," Timo said. Kenyon blinked. "You knew?" "I didn't know. I could have suspected. I work in the system, Kenyon, Henrico County. I've seen files, names that don't match up but feel familiar. I couldn't prove anything, and I wasn't sure enough to blow up the family over a feeling." He set the straw on the napkin. "His foster family's in Glen Allen. He's 3, he's healthy. He's got a social worker named Linda, who actually gives a damn, which in our system is basically winning the lottery. I want to find him. I know you do, and you can, but that's not why you called me." Timo looked at him, really looked, without the strategic filtering that Kenyon and Ken both used as default. "You called me because you're trying to figure out what to do about Kyra and Damien." Kenyon wrapped his hands around the coffee mug. It was chipped on the handle, a small triangle of white missing from the brown glaze. He ran his thumb over it. "I denied my son in court. Yeah. I looked straight ahead and said I had no biological connection to him. I know. I'm him. I'm exactly Dad." Timo leaned forward. "You're not. You want to know how I know. Because Dad would never be sitting in a diner on Broad Street having this conversation. Dad would be on the phone with a fixer right now figuring out how to bury the file. You're not burying anything. You're here. That's different." He paused. "It's not enough, but it's different. What do I do? You go to her, not with a lawyer, not with a plan. You go to her and you tell the truth and you let her decide what happens next. And whatever she says, whatever it is, you take it. Because she earned the right to say whatever she wants, and you earned the right to hear it." Kenyon looked at his coffee. The surface had a thin film on it. The diner smelled like bacon grease and the industrial soap they used on the floor. Rhonda walked past and topped off his mug without asking. He didn't drink it. "It's not too late," Timo said, "but it's going to cost you everything Dad built. You got to decide if you're okay with that." 4 weeks after the hearing, a Wednesday evening in early November, the kind of night in Petersburg where you could feel winter coming. Not here yet, but close. The air carrying that particular Virginia chill that gets under your collar and stays. Kenyon parked in Willa's driveway. Not on the street. In the driveway. A decision. A declaration. I am here and I am not hiding. The porch light was on. The chain-link gate had a latch that stuck. He had to lift and push at the same time. The metal was cold against his palm. 3 porch steps. The second one creaked. He'd remember that creak for the rest of his life. The specific pitch of it, the way the wood gave slightly under his weight, the half-second where he almost turned around. He knocked. Footsteps. A pause. The peephole going dark as someone looked through it. Willa opened the door. She was smaller than Kenyon had imagined, 5'3" maybe, wearing a housecoat and slippers and an expression that could have cut sheet metal. She looked at him for a long time. Didn't speak. Her eyes moved from his face to his shoes, to his car in the driveway and back to his face, and the look contained entire paragraphs. "You hurt my daughter. You abandoned my grandson. I know who your father is, and I know what your family does, and you are standing on my porch at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday, and I have not yet decided whether you're coming inside or leaving in an ambulance." "She's in the kitchen," Willa said, stepped aside. Not all the way. Just enough for him to pass. Her shoulder almost brushed his arm as he went through, and he felt it, the deliberateness of the almost contact. A woman who wanted him to know he was not welcome, he was tolerated. There was a canyon between those two things. The kitchen was small. Yellow walls that had faded to the color of old paper. A calendar on the fridge, the free kind from the insurance agency down the street, turned to November. The faucet dripped. You could time your whole life to it. Kyra was standing at the counter, warming a bottle. She was wearing a grey sweatshirt she'd had for years, Henrico High School, the letters cracked and peeling, and her hair was pulled back with a rubber band, not a proper hair tie, a rubber band. She had circles under her eyes dark enough to look like bruises. The counter next to her had a half-eaten granola bar, a mug of tea that had gone cold with the bag still in it, and a stack of medical bills held together with a binder clip. Damien was in a bouncer on the kitchen table, making gurgling noises, his fist wrapped around the edge of his blanket. 4 months old now, getting bigger every week in ways that amazed Kyra and terrified her in equal measure, because every ounce of growth was another ounce she had to feed and clothe and protect alone. Kyra turned around. She didn't drop the bottle, didn't gasp, didn't scream. She just looked at Kenyon standing in her mother's kitchen doorway, and her jaw tightened, and her eyes went hard, and for a long moment the only sound was the faucet and the TV mumbling in the other room, and Damien's soft, oblivious sounds. "I don't know how to do this," Kenyon said. His voice cracked on this, literally cracked, like a teenage boy's, and he didn't try to cover it. "I don't know how to be what he needs. My father taught me how to build things and control things, and I'm very good at that, and I'm realizing none of it matters." He stopped, swallowed. His hands were trembling. He put them in his pockets, then took them out, because hiding felt wrong. "I denied our son in a courtroom. I'm going to carry that. For the rest of my life, I'm going to carry that. I'm not here to ask you to forgive me. I'm here to ask you to let me try. Not for me, for him." Kyra set the bottle on the counter, crossed her arms. She was shaking too, not visibly, but Kenyon could see it in her jaw, in the tension across her shoulders, in the way she was gripping her own elbows like she was holding herself together with nothing but willpower and caffeine. "You get one chance." Her voice was steady, quieter than he expected. "One. And it's not because you earned it. You haven't. It's because he deserves a father who shows up, and I refuse to be the reason he doesn't get one." She paused. The faucet dripped. "But Kenyon, if you disappear again, if you let your father anywhere near this, if you break your word even once, I will raise him alone, and I will be extraordinary at it, and you will spend the rest of your life knowing exactly what you lost." Kenyon nodded. His eyes were wet. He didn't wipe them. Damien kicked in the bouncer and let out a sound, half squeal, half protest. The universal baby language for somebody, "Pay attention to me," and both of them looked at him at the same time. Kyra picked up the bottle, tested the temperature on her wrist, handed it to Kenyon. He stared at it. "Well," she said, "you said you wanted to try." Kenyon took the bottle, picked up his son for the first time. Damien was lighter than he expected, and heavier than anything he'd ever held. The baby's head settled against his forearm, and his eyes, blue, still deciding, brand new, looked up at Kenyon without recognition, without judgment, without any of the weight that every other pair of eyes in his life carried. Willa stood in the kitchen doorway, watching, arms crossed, expression unchanged. But she didn't leave. The faucet dripped. The porch light hummed through the window. Somewhere outside, a car passed with its bass thumping through the walls for 3 seconds, and then gone. Kenyon fed his son. Nobody spoke. That night, that kitchen, that bottle, that silence. It wasn't a happy ending. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a beginning. The smallest, most fragile kind of beginning. The kind that could fall apart with one wrong word, one broken promise, one phone call from Ken Carter. But it held. Somehow, against everything, it held. And what happened over the next 2 years? Well, that's the part of the story I've been waiting to tell you. 2 years later, the house on Meadow Street in the Fan District was nothing like the penthouse. It was a row house, narrow, 3 stories, built in 1923 and renovated just enough to keep the plumbing from being an emergency. The kitchen floor was original hardwood that creaked in the same spot every time you walked from the stove to the fridge. The backyard was 12 feet wide and mostly shade from the neighbor's maple tree that dropped leaves into the gutters every October, and nobody ever cleaned them out on time. The front door stuck in humid weather, which in Richmond meant June through September, which meant Kenyon had spent his first summer there, shouldering the door open like he was breaking into his own home. Kyra loved it. Not because it was perfect, because it wasn't. Because the radiator in the upstairs bathroom clanked at 6 a.m. every morning like an alarm clock nobody asked for. And the dishwasher had a setting called normal that was actually aggressive, and the closet in the master bedroom was so small that Kenyon's suits, the few he'd kept, had to be stored in the hall closet next to Damien's stroller and a box of teaching supplies Kyra kept meaning to organize. They'd moved in together 8 months after the hearing. Not quickly. Nothing about the process had been quick. Kenyon had spent the first 4 months proving himself in increments so small they were almost invisible. Showing up. That was it. Showing up at Willa's house in Petersburg 3 times a week, then 4, then every day. Feeding Damien, changing Damien, falling asleep in the rocking chair, in the room that used to be Kyra's childhood bedroom, the one with the lavender walls, with Damien on his chest at 3 in the morning, while Kyra slept for the first uninterrupted 6 hours she'd had since the delivery. He didn't try to buy anything, didn't offer money, didn't mention the firm or the penthouse or any of the infrastructure of the life he'd dismantled. He just showed up in jeans and a wrinkled button-down with a coffee stain on the cuff that he never seemed to notice, and he sat on the floor with his son, and he learned. Willa watched all of it, from the kitchen doorway mostly, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She didn't warm to Kenyon quickly. She didn't warm to anyone quickly, a trait Kyra had inherited without realizing it, but sometime around month 3, she started setting a 3rd plate at dinner. She didn't announce it. The plate was just there. The second hearing had gone differently than the first. Kenyon had appeared without attorneys. He'd acknowledged paternity in open court, submitted to the DNA test. He accepted the child support determination without negotiation. Judge Garrison had looked at him over her reading glasses, the same beaded chain, the same NPR mug on the bench, and said, "Mr. Carter, is there anything else you'd like to add?" And Kenyon had said, "I denied my son. I was wrong. I'd like to be on record saying that, for him, so that when he's old enough to read this file, he knows I said it." Judge Garrison had written something down, nodded, moved on to the next item. Kyra, sitting in that courtroom for the second time, had looked down at her hands and realized they weren't shaking. The petition for Marcus had taken longer. Family court, state bureaucracy, background checks and home studies, and a social worker named Linda, who asked questions that felt like she was reading your soul through a clipboard. Kenyon had been patient. Uncharacteristically, almost comically patient. The man who used to close 7-figure deals in 48 hours was now waiting 3 weeks for a callback from a county office that was understaffed and running on a budget that hadn't been updated since 2019. Timo helped. Navigated the system from the inside, pulled the right strings. Not the kind of strings their father pulled, not favors and leverage, but the quiet kind, the I know someone who knows someone who actually cares kind. Marcus's foster family in Glen Allen, a couple named Bill and Janet who'd been fostering for 11 years, agreed to supervised visits. The first visit was at a park off Staples Mill Road, March. Still cold enough for jackets. Marcus was 3.5, brown hair, brown eyes, a gap in his front teeth, and a blue jacket with a dinosaur patch on the sleeve that was starting to come loose. He didn't know Kenyon, didn't know who he was, didn't know that the tall man sitting on the bench with the nervous hands was his half-brother. Kenyon sat on the bench and watched Marcus go down the slide 14 times, counted each one, didn't approach, didn't push, just sat there in the weak March sun with a lump in his throat that wouldn't dissolve, watching a 3-year-old who had his mother's eyes run across the mulch in light-up sneakers that flashed blue with every step. Kyra had come along, sat next to him, didn't say anything for the first 10 minutes, then, "He looks like her, like Tonya. Yeah, you okay?" Kenyon watched Marcus climb the ladder again. The dinosaur patch flapped in the wind. "Not yet." She put her hand on his knee, left it there. By the time they moved into the Meadow Street house, the custody petition for Marcus was in its final stages. Bill and Janet, who were good people, the kind of good that doesn't need recognition, had agreed to a gradual transition. Marcus started spending weekends at the house, then overnights. Then by August he had his own room, small, painted green because he'd pointed at a paint chip at the hardware store on Carey Street and said, "That one," with the absolute certainty that only 3-year-olds possess. Damien was 14 months old, Walking now, the staggering, confident but wrong kind of walking that involves grabbing furniture and falling and getting back up and doing it again. He and Marcus had developed a bond that defied every clinical term in Timo's social work vocabulary. Marcus called him the baby, which later became my baby and which later became just his name. Damien, come here, said with the possessive authority of a big brother who decided his job was to be in charge, and nobody had consulted him on this, but that was fine because he hadn't asked. Kenyon had started working at a legal aid office in Shockoe Bottom, pro bono family law. The pay was a third of what he'd made at the firm. The office had a coffee machine that made sounds like it was dying every morning at 8, and the fluorescent light in the conference room flickered in a way that everyone had gotten used to, but nobody had fixed. He didn't mind. He was good at the work. It turned out that knowing how the system operated also meant knowing how to help people who were getting crushed by it. Ken Carter had not spoken to Kenyon in 9 months. That silence had its own weight, heavy at first, then gradually lighter, like a bruise that changes color week by week. You still see it, you still remember how you got it, but one morning you press on it and it doesn't hurt anymore, and you realize you forgot to check yesterday and the day before that. Willa came for dinner on Sundays. She still didn't say much, but she brought pie, sweet potato from scratch, the recipe she hadn't been able to make for years because of her arthritis, which had gotten better since Kyra started paying for the prescription her mother had been skipping to save money. Willa's pie was too sweet and slightly burnt on one edge, and Kenyon ate 2 slices every time and told her it was perfect. She told him to stop lying and pass the whipped cream. On a Sunday in October, almost exactly 2 years after Damien was born, Kyra stood at the kitchen window of the Meadow Street house and watched Kenyon in the backyard. He was sitting cross-legged on the grass with Marcus on one side and Damien in his lap, trying to build a block tower that Damien kept knocking down with the kind of gleeful destruction that is the exclusive domain of toddlers. Marcus was rebuilding the tower each time, patient and focused, tongue sticking out the way it did when he concentrated. Kenyon was laughing, the real laugh, the one she'd first heard at the coat check at the Valentine Museum 3 years ago, the one that didn't perform anything for anybody. The kitchen smelled like the onions she'd been chopping for soup. Her eyes were watering. The onions, she told herself, just the onions. And the counter was a mess of cutting boards and spice jars and a sippy cup that had rolled behind the toaster. The radio on the windowsill was playing something she didn't recognize, turned low. She thought about the courtroom, the folder, the way Kenyon's voice had sounded when he denied their son, flat, rehearsed, like something a machine produced. She thought about her father's car in the driveway. There one morning, gone the next. She thought about Rennie, about the hospital bathroom, about the crack in the Honda's windshield that she'd never fixed, because some broken things you just learn to see through. And she thought about Damien, about Marcus, about the 2 of them in the backyard, with a man who had denied his own son in open court, and then spent 2 years rebuilding himself from the ground up, not because it was easy and not because he was forgiven, but because he decided, for the first time in his life, to stop being the man his father made and start being the man his children needed. The block tower fell again. Damien shrieked. Marcus sighed. Kenyon picked up the blocks, started over. This is a story about what happens when the truth refuses to stay buried, and what it costs to stop running from it. It's about a woman who had every reason to build walls, and a man who had to demolish everything he knew before he could deserve to stand on the other side of hers. It's about sealed files and courtroom silences, and a 3-year-old in light-up sneakers who didn't know he had a family waiting for him 30 minutes away. But mostly, it's about this. The people who hurt us the most are sometimes the ones carrying wounds we can't see. That doesn't make the hurt okay, it doesn't erase it, but understanding where it came from, really understanding, not excusing, not forgiving on demand but seeing, is sometimes the first step toward something better. Not perfect, better. Kyra Stone chose to let Kenyon try, not because she was naive or weak or forgiving by nature, because she was brave enough to believe that people can change, and honest enough to demand proof before she believed it, and Kenyon Carter chose to stay, not because staying was easy, because leaving was the one thing he knew how to do, and he was done being good at the wrong things. And you, what would you do if the person who hurt you the most came back and asked for one more chance? Hey, if you're still here, thank you. Seriously. I don't take that for granted, not even for a second. You could have scrolled past. You could have clicked away. You could have done 100 other things with the last hour. But you stayed. You stayed for Kyra, you stayed for Kenyon, you stayed for a little boy named Damien, and a 3-year-old in light-up sneakers named Marcus. And that means something to me. These stories, that they take time, they take heart, and honestly they take a little piece of me every time I tell one. But I keep doing it because of you. Because every comment you leave, every time you share this with someone who needs to hear it, every time you hit that subscribe button, you're telling me that these stories matter. That the mess and the pain and the healing and the trying again, it's worth talking about. So if this one got to you, if something in Kyra's fight or Kenyon's fall or Willa's quiet strength made you feel something real, do me a favor, subscribe, hit the bell, and leave me a comment telling me what you would have done. Would you have given him that one chance, or would you have kept that door closed? I read every single comment, every one. And I'll be back soon with another story that I promise will keep you up past your bedtime. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other. See you in the next one.